They called her a warrior once. Now she won't even meet your eyes, the old trader had said. But Ethan Cole didn't believe in stories that arrived after sundown. Not out here where the wind carried more lies than truth and a man survived by keeping his door closed and his questions fewer. Yet that night the wind felt different, slower somehow, like it was watching. And when he stepped out onto his porch with a lantern hanging low in his hand, he saw her standing there just beyond the reach of the light, barefoot in the dust, shoulders squared but head slightly bowed, as if she had forgotten how to stand without armor. And for a long second neither of them spoke, the air dry, the smell of leather and ash drifting between them, until she finally said, quiet but steady, I don't need kindness, just permission to stay. And there was something in the way she chose those words, careful, measured, like each one had weight, that made Ethan pause instead of turning her away like he should have, because out here strangers meant trouble and trouble meant loss, and he had buried enough already. So he lifted the lantern a little higher, letting the light find her face, and what he saw wasn't what he expected, not fear exactly, not desperation either, but something older, something that had learned to survive long before it learned to ask, her clothes worn thin like they had seen more miles than a horse could carry, her hands steady despite the cold, and her eyes didn't search his for mercy. They studied him, measured distance, exits, angles, as if even now she was calculating. And that was the first thing that didn't make sense, because people who beg don't calculate. They wait, they hope. But she didn't wait, she endured, and Ethan felt it before he understood it, like a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. No strangers stay, he said, his voice flat. The kind of rule that had kept him alive longer than most men out here. And for a moment she didn't answer, just stood there with the wind brushing past her like it belonged to her. Then she nodded once, small, almost respectful, and turned as if to leave. No argument, no pleading, just acceptance. And that was the second thing that didn't make sense. Because people with nowhere to go don't walk away that easily. Not unless they've learned that doors always close. And something in Ethan tightened, something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not quite. Just recognition. Like seeing a reflection you didn't ask for. And before he could think it through, before he could remind himself why rules existed, he said, you can stay till morning. And she stopped, just for a breath, then turned back, not smiling, not relieved, just nodding again like it was a transaction already settled. And when she stepped into the light, Ethan noticed the smallest detail. The way her feet touched the ground first on the balls, silent, controlled. The kind of movement you don't unlearn, not even when you've lost everything else. And inside the cabin the fire was low, casting long shadows across the walls, and she stood just inside the door, not moving further, not assuming anything, waiting for direction. And Ethan gestured toward a chair near the table. You can sit, but she didn't. Instead she moved to the far wall where she could see both the door and the window, and settled there with her back never fully turned. And that was the third thing that didn't make sense, because servants don't choose their position. They take what they're given. But she chose, quietly, without asking. And as the minutes passed, the silence stretched, thick but not uncomfortable, just watchful. And Ethan found himself noticing things he hadn't planned to. The faint marks along her forearms, not fresh, not accidental. Patterns maybe, or memory. The way her breathing stayed, even no matter how the wind rattled the shutters. The way her gaze drifted to every sound before it finished happening. And he realized he hadn't asked her name. Not because he didn't care, but because names had a way of making things real, and real things had a way of staying, and he wasn't sure he wanted that. Not again, not after everything. So he kept quiet, and so did she. Until finally she spoke, almost to herself. This place, it's quiet. And Ethan let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had any warmth in it. That's the point, he said. And she nodded like she understood more than he said. Like she understood why a man would choose silence over company. And then the fire cracked, a small sound. Ordinary, but she shifted slightly, just enough to change her angle. And Ethan saw it clearly then. The readiness that never left her. The way she existed between moments. Never fully resting, never fully safe. And it hit him, not as a thought, but as a feeling, heavy and slow, that whatever she had been before she stood on his porch tonight hadn't left her, not really. And out beyond the cabin, far past the reach of the lantern light, something moved. Along the ridge, distant, almost nothing, but the kind of nothing that carried intention, and Ethan didn't see it yet, but she did, her eyes lifting just slightly, her body still, listening to something he couldn't hear, and for the first time since she stepped inside, there was a flicker of something in her expression, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, sharp and immediate, and she whispered, barely audible, "They don't stop." And Ethan frowned. Who doesn't? But she didn't answer, not right away, just kept looking toward the darkness like it was already closer than it should be, and the wind shifted again, carrying a sound too distant to name, and the quiet, the same quiet Ethan had built his life around, suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. The wind did not rise all at once. It crept in low and steady, brushing against the cabin walls like something testing the edges of a place it had not been invited to enter, and Ethan Cole felt it in the floorboards before he heard it in the distance, a rhythm too measured to be the land alone. And across the room Lyra had not moved except for her eyes, still fixed somewhere beyond the window where the dark stretched for miles. And when he followed her gaze, he saw nothing but open land and the faint outline of the ridge cutting the sky. But she was listening to something deeper than sight, something carried through the air that did not belong to the wind, and Ethan shifted his weight, slow, careful, the way a man does when he realizes he may not be the one in control of the moment. "You said they do not stop," he said, his voice low, not a question anymore, but a piece of truth he was trying to place, and she finally looked at him, really looked this time, and there was no hesitation in her answer. "They do not lose what they claim." And the way she said claim made it sound like ownership, not of land, not of things, but of people, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not yet, but recognition of a kind of trouble that did not pass by on its own, and outside the wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound that might have been hooves, or might have been something else entirely, too distant to name, but too deliberate to ignore, and Lyra stood then, not abruptly, not in panic, but with a quiet certainty that told him she had already decided something, and she moved toward the door without asking, stopping just short of it, her hand hovering near the wood but not touching, as if she respected the boundary even now, and Ethan watched her for a long second before stepping forward, placing himself between her and the door without thinking, the motion instinctive, protective in a way he had not allowed himself to be in years. "If someone is coming," he said, "you tell me what I am standing in the middle of." And she did not answer right away, her eyes flicking to his shoulder, then past him, measuring space, measuring time, and when she finally spoke, it was softer than before, but heavier. "You are standing between them and a decision they already made." And that was the fourth thing that did not make sense, because decisions like that did not belong to strangers passing through the night. They belonged to people with purpose, with history, with something unfinished, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows the quiet he built is about to break whether he wants it to or not. And he stepped aside just enough to reach the door, opening it a few inches, letting the cold air slide in, carrying with it the smell of dust and something metallic, something unfamiliar, and the horizon looked the same at first, empty, still, but then he saw it, a line of movement along the ridge, not fast, not loud, just present, shapes against the darker sky, and they were not rushing, not charging, just approaching with a patience that felt worse than urgency, because it meant they had time, and people with time do not make mistakes, and Ethan closed the door slowly, the wood settling back into place with a quiet finality, and when he turned back, Lyra had moved again, not toward the center of the room, but toward the shadows, positioning herself where the firelight did not fully reach, and he noticed the way her breathing stayed even, the way her shoulders did not tense, and it struck him then that she was not afraid of them, not in the way most people would be. She was preparing, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered more than anything he could say. "You could have kept walking," he said, not accusing, just stating the truth that had been sitting between them since she arrived, and she met his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said, and nothing more, no explanation, no justification, just that one word that carried more weight than any story she could have told. And Ethan understood it in a way he did not expect, because staying was not always about needing help. Sometimes it was about choosing where the line would be drawn, and he had the sudden, quiet realization that whatever followed those shapes on the ridge, whatever crossed the distance between here and there, would not be something that passed through and moved on. It would stay, in one way or another, and the cabin felt smaller then, not in size, but in meaning, like it was no longer just a place to sleep and eat and wait out the seasons, but something else. Entirely, something that would be tested before the night was over, and Lyra reached up then, slowly, deliberately, and from beneath the worn fabric at her collar, she pulled a small piece of metal, dull in the firelight, etched with lines too precise to be decoration, and she held it in her palm for a moment, looking at it like it belonged to another life, another version of herself, and then she closed her hand around it again, not hiding it, not displaying it, just holding it like a memory. She could not put down, and Ethan did not ask what it was, because he already knew it was not something simple, not something that could be explained in a sentence or two, and outside the shapes on the ridge did not stop. They kept moving, steady, patient, inevitable, and the wind that had once carried only dust now carried something else, something that felt like a question being asked of the land itself. And inside the cabin, between the door and the fire, and the two people who had no reason to trust each other, and yet had not walked away, the silence settled again, heavier this time, as if it understood what was coming before either of them said it out loud. The silence did not break when the shapes grew closer. It deepened, pressing into the walls of the cabin like a weight neither of them could move. And Ethan Cole stood there with his hand resting near the door, as if the wood itself could hold back whatever was coming. While across the room Lyra remained in the shadow, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, but something in her eyes had shifted, not fear, not urgency, but acceptance, like a person who had reached the end of running long, before their legs gave out. And Ethan noticed it in the smallest way, the way her shoulders settled, the way her gaze no longer searched for escape. And that was when he understood that whatever followed her was not something she expected to outrun, only something she had chosen to face, and outside the faint rhythm carried closer, no longer distant enough to ignore, still measured, still patient, like footsteps that knew exactly where they were going. And Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he realizes the next moment will not belong to him. "You brought this here," he said, not accusing, just placing the truth between them where it could not be avoided, and Lyra did not look away. "No," she answered, quiet, certain. It was already coming, and that answer hung in the air longer than it should have, because it shifted something fundamental, turned the situation from intrusion into inevitability, and Ethan felt that shift settle into his chest, heavy but clear. And he moved then, not toward the door, not toward the window, but toward the table where the lantern sat, lowering the flame just enough to dim the light without extinguishing it, because light attracts attention, and attention is not always something a man wants, and Lyra watched him do it with a stillness that felt like approval, or at least understanding. And when the room fell into deeper shadow, the world outside seemed to press closer, the line between inside and out thinning with every passing second, and Ethan glanced toward her again. "You said they claim what is theirs," he said. "What did they lose?" And for the first time since she had stepped into his cabin, there was a pause in her answer, not hesitation, but selection, like she was choosing which truth mattered. And when she spoke, it was not the full story. But it was enough, someone who refused to stay where she was placed. And Ethan let that sit for a moment, turning it over in his mind like a coin that did not quite belong to him. And he nodded once, slow, because he understood that kind of refusal more than he would ever say out loud. And outside the shapes along the ridge stopped, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a quiet halt that sent a different kind of tension through the air, because movement you can track, but stillness forces you to wait. And waiting is where doubt grows, and Ethan felt it then, the pull to act, to step outside, to confront whatever stood there in the dark, but he did not move, not yet, because there was something in the way Lyra remained where she was that told him this was not a moment for action. It was a moment for choice, and choices like this did not come twice. And Lyra shifted then, just slightly, stepping out of the deeper shadow into the edge of the firelight, and in that half-light he saw her. More clearly than before, not the worn clothes or the dust on her skin, but the lines of her posture, the balance she carried even in stillness. And it struck him again how wrong the word servant felt when placed next to her, like calling a storm a breeze. And she looked at him, not past him this time, not through him, but directly, and there was something in that look that felt like a question without words, and Ethan did not answer it out loud. He simply stepped forward, closing the distance between them by a few feet, placing himself not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, and it was a small movement, simple, almost nothing, but it carried weight in a way neither of them needed to explain, and Lyra's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second, something like surprise, quickly buried under the same steady calm, and outside the wind shifted again, and with it came a sound, closer now, not loud, not threatening, just present, like the land itself acknowledging what stood upon it, and Ethan felt his grip tighten slightly, not on a weapon, but on the moment itself, because he knew, with a clarity that surprised him, that whatever crossed that distance between the ridge and his door would not define him by what it was, but by what he chose to be when it arrived. And Lyra spoke then, not to warn him, not to ask anything, but simply to state what was already true. You can still step away. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a smile without warmth. No, he said, just that one word, simple, final, and for a moment nothing else moved. Not the wind, not the shadows, not even the thoughts between them. And then, slowly, deliberately, Lyra opened her hand, revealing the small metal piece she had held before, and in the dim light it caught just enough glow to show its shape. Precise, deliberate, something made with purpose, not decoration, and she did not explain it, did not offer it. She simply let it be seen, and Ethan looked at it for a second longer than he intended, then lifted his gaze back to her. And in that quiet exchange something settled between them. Not trust, not yet, but alignment. The understanding that whatever came next would not be faced alone, and outside, along the ridge, the shapes began to move again, descending now, steady, inevitable, and the night, which had once been empty and wide, suddenly felt very small. The distance between the ridge and the cabin did not seem far until you had to measure it in waiting, and Ethan Cole felt every second stretch longer than it should, like time itself was reluctant to carry what was coming any closer, while the shapes moved with quiet certainty down the slope, never rushing, never hesitating, and that was what unsettled him most. Not speed, not noise, but purpose, the kind that does not change once it begins, and beside him Lyra did not step back into shadow. This time she remained where she stood, half in the low firelight, half in the dark, as if she belonged to both and neither, and her hand still held that small metal piece, not tight, not loose, just present, like a truth she had decided not to hide anymore. And Ethan glanced at it again, not asking, not yet, but understanding that it mattered more than anything either of them had said, and outside the first sound came clear enough to name, not loud, not sharp, just a shift in the ground, like weight, settling where it had not been before, and then another, and another, until the silence itself felt crowded, and Ethan moved toward the door, not opening it, just placing his hand against the wood, feeling the faint vibration that traveled through it, subtle but real, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, not out of fear, but to listen the way men used to listen before they trusted their eyes too much. And when he opened them again, he spoke without turning. How many? And Lyra answered, without looking away from the door, enough. And that word carried no number, no limit, just certainty. And Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that steadies a man when there is nothing left to prepare, and he turned the latch, opening the door just enough to step out onto the porch, the cold air meeting him immediately, sharp against his skin, carrying the scent of dust, and something else he still could not name. And the land stretched out before him, the ridge now behind the figures, the figures themselves closer than before, no longer just shapes but presence, spaced apart, moving with a coordination that spoke of something learned, something practiced, and yet there was no rush in them, no urgency, only the steady closing of distance. And Ethan stood there for a moment, not reaching for anything, not calling out, just watching, because some moments do not ask for action, they ask for witness. And behind him, he could feel Lyra step closer, not beside him, not behind him, but just inside the doorway, a position that allowed her to see without being seen fully. and he understood that choice without needing to ask, and the wind shifted again, brushing past them both, carrying with it a faint sound that might have been a voice or might have been the land itself responding. And Ethan spoke then, not loudly, not as a challenge, just enough to be heard if hearing was what they intended. "You came a long way for someone who walked in on her own." And the words hung in the air between him and the approaching figures, and for a moment nothing answered, not the wind, not the land, not the distance. And then one of the figures slowed slightly, not stopping, just adjusting. And something in that small change told Ethan more than any words could have, that he had been heard, that what stood out there was not blind, not mindless, but aware, and aware things make choices, and choices can be met. And Ethan felt that realization settle into him. Not heavy, not light, just clear, and behind him Lyra spoke, her voice low, steady. "They do not expect you to speak." And Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a faint smile if anyone had been close enough to see it. "Then they should not expect me to stay quiet," he said, and for the first time since she arrived, there was the smallest shift in Lyra's expression, something almost like recognition, quickly gone, but real enough to leave its mark. And outside the figures stopped again, closer now, close enough that the distance between them could no longer be ignored, and Ethan could see more clearly, not faces, not details, but posture, the way they held themselves, balanced, controlled, and it mirrored something he had seen inside his cabin only moments before, and that was when the final piece settled into place, not as fear, not as understanding, but as alignment. The realization that whatever stood out there and whatever stood behind him came from the same kind of world, a world that did not belong to his fences or his rules, and yet had found its way to his door, and Ethan did not step back, did not close the door, did not reach for anything to change what was already unfolding. He simply stood where he was, a man on a porch in the middle of land that had never promised him anything. And inside the doorway Lyra opened her hand fully now, letting the metal piece catch the faint light from the cabin, not raising it, not presenting it, just allowing it to exist in the space between what was and what was coming. And the wind carried that moment outward, thin and sharp, and for a heartbeat everything held still, not because it was over, but because something had just begun. No one spoke when the distance finally stopped shrinking, because some moments do not need words, they need acknowledgement. And Ethan Cole stood there on his porch with the night pressing in around him, feeling the weight of eyes that did not rush, did not threaten, but simply waited, and waiting like that carried its own kind of authority, and he understood it in a way that settled deep, because men who rush are uncertain, but those who wait already know how things will end. And beside him, just inside the doorway, Lyra did not move forward, did not retreat. She remained exactly where she had chosen to stand, her hand open, the small piece of metal catching just enough light to exist without explanation, and Ethan glanced at it once more, not out of curiosity now, but recognition, because whatever that object meant to her, it was the only thing she had not hidden, and that made it more honest than anything else in this moment. And out in the dark, one of the figures stepped a fraction closer, not breaking the space, just testing it, and Ethan noticed the detail that mattered most, not what they carried, not how many there were, but how they held themselves, balanced, measured, the same quiet readiness he had seen in Lyra since the moment she arrived, and that told him more than any introduction could have. And he spoke again, not louder, not softer, just steady. "She walked here on her own." And the words carried across the space between them, simple, clear, and for a moment nothing answered, but something shifted, not in the air, not in the land, but in the attention directed toward him, like a weight being placed where it had not been before. And Lyra's voice came quietly from behind him. "They do not listen to reason." And Ethan did not turn, did not look back. He kept his eyes forward. "Then they can listen to something else," he said. And there was no challenge in his tone, no threat, just presence, and presence, he had learned, could carry farther than noise ever could. And the wind moved again, low and steady, brushing past his coat, lifting a strand of Lyra's hair just enough to catch the faint light. And for a brief second the metal in her hand reflected something sharper, something deliberate, and one of the figures out there paused, not in fear, not in surprise, but in recognition, and that pause rippled outward, subtle but real, and Ethan felt it without fully understanding it. Like a shift in a current you cannot see but know is there, and he realized then that whatever stood out there was not just watching him. It was watching her, measuring, deciding, and that meant the moment had already moved beyond him, beyond his cabin, beyond the simple act of letting someone stay until morning. It had become something else entirely, something that belonged to her past, and had followed her into his present, and Ethan let out a slow breath, steady, controlled, because there was only one thing left to decide, not what they would do, but who he would be when they did it. And he took one step forward off the porch, just enough to place himself fully between the cabin and the figures, not closing the distance, not challenging it, just defining the line. And behind him Lyra did not stop him, did not call out. She simply watched. And that was the first time he understood that her silence was not uncertainty. It was respect for the choice he was making, and the night held that moment, stretched it thin, until even the wind seemed to quiet. And then, slowly, Lyra stepped forward as well, not beside him, not in front, but just behind his shoulder, close enough that he could feel her presence without seeing her. And she lifted her hand slightly, not high, not dramatic, just enough for the metal to catch the faintest edge of light. And this time the reaction was clearer, not movement, not retreat, but stillness with meaning, the kind that comes when something expected has changed. And Ethan did not look at her, did not need to. He could feel the shift. And he spoke once more, quieter now, not for them, but for the space between everything that had led to this moment. You said they claim what is theirs, he said, but she is still standing here. And the words settled into the night. Simple, undeniable, and for a long second nothing moved. And then one of the figures lowered their posture just slightly, not in surrender, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. And that small change carried farther than any action could have, because it meant something had been reconsidered, not abandoned, not finished, just reconsidered. And Ethan felt the tension shift again, not gone, not resolved, but altered, like a storm that chooses not to break. And behind him Lyra's voice came once more, softer than before, almost something like disbelief. You do not understand what you are standing against. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, eyes still forward. No, he said, but I understand what I am standing for. And that was the moment everything settled, not into peace, not into safety, but into something quieter, something heavier, the kind of silence that does not end a story, but changes the direction of it. And out there in the dark, the figures did not move closer, did not retreat. They simply remained, as if the line Ethan had drawn without asking permission had become something they could not ignore. And inside the doorway, the faint glow of the fire continued to flicker, steady, unchanged, as if the cabin itself had decided to stand just as still as the man on its porch. And Lyra lowered her hand slightly, not hiding the metal, not releasing it, just holding it at her side now. And for the first time since she arrived, her posture shifted, not into rest, but into something that looked almost like balance. And the night, which had come carrying weight and distance and something inevitable, now held something else as well, something that had not been there before, something quiet, unspoken, but undeniable. The night did not release its hold after that moment. It tightened in a quieter way, like something unseen had shifted its weight, but not its intention. And Ethan Cole remained where he stood, one step off his porch, boots pressed into the dry earth that had never promised him safety, while the figures in the distance held their place, no longer advancing, no longer retreating, simply existing within the same stretch of land as him. And that alone was enough to change the air, because distance had turned into presence, and presence has a way of asking questions a man cannot ignore. And behind him Lyra stood just close enough that he could feel the steadiness in her breathing, not hurried, not uneven, just controlled, like someone who had long ago learned that panic only wastes what little time you have. And Ethan let the silence sit for a while longer, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by words alone. And the wind passed between them again, softer now, almost careful, as if it too was waiting to see what would be decided. And Ethan finally spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just enough to break the stillness without shattering it. You came this far without forcing your way in, he said, his eyes fixed on the shapes ahead. That tells me you still believe in something. And the words carried out into the open space. Not as a challenge, not as a plea, just a statement placed where it could be accepted or ignored. And for a moment nothing answered. And then, slowly, one of the figures shifted again, not forward, not back, just a slight change in posture that felt deliberate, like a response without sound. And Ethan felt it register in the same quiet place where instinct lived. And he understood then that whatever stood out there was listening, not just hearing, but weighing. And that meant the line he had drawn still mattered. And behind him Lyra spoke again, her voice lower than before, almost reluctant. "They do not come for belief," she said. "They come for order." And Ethan nodded slightly, even though she could not see his face from where she stood. "Then, maybe they forgot what order is supposed to protect," he replied. And that was when something shifted more clearly, not in the figures themselves, but in the space between them, like a tension being pulled in two directions at once. And Lyra stepped forward then, just enough that she stood beside him instead of behind. And that small movement carried more weight than anything she had said, because it was not about defense. It was about presence. And she lifted her hand again, not higher than before, just enough for the metal to catch the faint light of the cabin. And this time she did not hide it, did not angle it away. She let it face outward, and Ethan saw the detail. More clearly now, the lines etched into it precise, intentional, not worn down by time, but preserved. And he understood without asking that this was not something she carried out of habit. It was something she had chosen not to leave behind. And out in the dark, the figures reacted again, not with movement, but with a deeper stillness, the kind that settles when recognition becomes undeniable. And Ethan felt that shift pass through him like a quiet current. And he realized something he had not considered before, that whatever they were waiting for, it was not him, it was her, and the decision had always belonged to her, not to the land, not to the distance, not even to the ones who had come to claim her. And that realization changed the weight of the moment, made it heavier in a different way, because standing in front of something is one thing, but standing beside someone while they choose is another entirely. And Ethan let out a slow breath, steady, grounding, and he did not step forward again, did not speak again. He simply remained. And that was the first time since the night began that the stillness felt like it belonged to him as well. And Lyra's voice came once more, softer now, but clearer. "I was not meant to leave," she said, not as a confession, not as an excuse, just as a truth she had decided to place into the open. And Ethan did not turn to look at her, did not interrupt. He let the words settle where they were meant to land, and she continued, "And I was not meant to return." And that second sentence carried something different, something final, like a door that had already been closed. And Ethan understood then that whatever stood out there did not come to retrieve her. They came to restore something that had been broken, something she had already refused. And that made the moment sharper, clearer, because it was no longer about pursuit. It was about resolution. And resolutions do not always end the way they begin. And the wind moved again, brushing past them both, lifting dust in a thin line that drifted between the porch and the open land. And in that brief movement, the metal in Lyra's hand caught the light just enough to reflect something outward, not bright, not blinding, just enough to be seen. And for a heartbeat everything held, the figures, the land, the air itself. And then, slowly, one of the figures lowered their head, not fully, not deeply, but enough to be unmistakable. And that small motion carried more meaning than any action could have, because it was not submission, it was acknowledgement. And Ethan felt that realization settle into him with a quiet certainty, that whatever had come to claim her had just been forced to recognize something it had not expected, not resistance, not defiance, but choice. And beside him Lyra did not move, did not step forward or back. She simply stood there, holding the weight of that moment without shifting under it. And Ethan understood then, with a clarity that did not need words, that the night had not ended, the story had not resolved, but something fundamental had changed, something that would carry forward into whatever came next. And for the first time since she stepped onto his porch, Lyra's posture eased, not into weakness, not into relief, but into something quieter, something steadier, like a person who had just stopped running not because the path was safe, but because it was finally hers to walk. The acknowledgement did not end anything. It only changed the shape of what followed, and Ethan Cole felt it settle into the ground beneath his boots, a quiet shift that turned tension into something more deliberate, more focused, as if the night itself had chosen to listen instead of push, and the figures in the distance remained where they were, no longer testing the line, no longer pressing forward, but not leaving either. And that stillness carried weight because it meant they were waiting for something else now, not movement, not resistance, but decision, and beside him Lyra did not lower her hand completely, the metal still catching the faintest trace of light, her fingers steady around it, not tight, not loose, just certain, and Ethan glanced at her then, not fully turning, just enough to see the edge of her profile, the way her gaze remained fixed outward, not searching, not calculating anymore, but settled. And that was new, that was different, and it told him more than anything she had said, and he spoke quietly, almost to the space between them. They stopped because of you. And she answered just as quietly, they stopped because they remembered. And that word lingered, heavier than the rest, because memory does not belong to the moment. It belongs to something deeper, something that does not fade just because time has passed, and Ethan let that sit, turning it over without forcing it into meaning, because some things reveal themselves only when left alone, and the wind moved again, softer now, carrying less edge, like it too had recognized the shift, and the land stretched out in front of them unchanged in shape but altered in presence, no longer empty, no longer distant, but shared. And Ethan realized that this was the first time since the figures appeared that the space between them did not feel like a threat. It felt like a question waiting to be answered, and he understood then that whatever came next would not be decided by force or distance, but by something quieter, something that required stillness to hear. And Lyra stepped forward one more time, not toward the figures, not away from them, but into the open space just beyond the porch, her movement slow, deliberate, carrying no hesitation, and Ethan did not reach for her, did not stop her, because he knew now that this was not something he could stand in front of, it was something he could only stand beside, and she lowered her hand slightly, the metal now resting at her side, visible but no longer held up as a signal, and that change was subtle but important, because it was no longer about being seen, it was about being present. And for a moment nothing else moved, not the figures, not the wind, not even the faint sounds that had filled the night before. And then, slowly, one of the figures took a step back, not retreating, not breaking formation, just creating space. And that single step carried meaning far beyond its size, because it was not a reaction to fear, it was a response to recognition, and Ethan felt it clearly. Like a line that had been drawn without words was now being respected, and Lyra's voice came. Again, steady, grounded. They were not sent for me, she said. They were sent for what I was. And Ethan nodded slightly, understanding more than she had explained, because he had seen men change before, seen them walk away from names and roles that no longer fit, and he knew that what people come to reclaim is often not the person standing in front of them, but the memory they refuse to let go. And he spoke then, not loudly, not to challenge, just to place the truth where it could exist. And you are not that anymore. And she did not answer right away, her gaze still fixed ahead, and when she did speak, it was softer than before, almost something like release. No, she said, I am not. And that simple admission carried more weight than anything that had come before, because it was not for them, it was not for him, it was for herself, and the night seemed to absorb it, hold it, and then let it settle into the space between everything that had led to this moment. And out there, the figures did not move closer again, did not press the distance. Instead they remained where they were, as if something had shifted in their understanding as well. And Ethan realized that this was not the end of their presence, but it was the end of their certainty, and certainty is what drives action, and without it, even the most deliberate path can pause. And beside him Lyra exhaled slowly, the first sign of release he had seen since she arrived. Not relief, not safety, but acceptance of something that no longer needed to be chased or resisted. And Ethan felt the weight in his chest ease just slightly, not because the danger had passed, but because the moment had changed, and he spoke once more, quieter now, almost to himself. You said they do not stop. And she glanced at him then, just briefly. They do not, she replied, And there was no contradiction in her voice, no uncertainty, just truth layered over truth. Because stopping and changing direction are not the same thing, and Ethan understood that, felt it settle into place like something that had been waiting to be realized, and the wind passed between them again, carrying the faint scent of dust and distance, and the figures in the dark remained, no longer advancing, no longer claiming, just watching, as if the story they had come to finish had already taken a different turn, and Lyra lowered her hand fully now, the metal resting against her side, no longer needed to be shown, no longer used as a signal, just a part of her again, and Ethan stood there beside her, not as a barrier, not as a shield, but as a witness to something that did not belong to him, and yet had changed him all the same, and the night, which had arrived carrying weight and inevitability, now held something quieter, something unresolved but no longer pressing, and for the first time since the wind shifted and the shapes appeared on the ridge, the land felt wide again, not empty, not safe, but open, like a path that had not been decided yet, but no longer needed to be feared. The night did not end. It unfolded, slow and deliberate, like a story that had decided to take a different path without asking permission, and Ethan Cole remained where he stood, the weight in his chest no longer pressing forward but settling inward, quieter, steadier, as the figures in the distance held their ground, no longer approaching, no longer testing, but still present enough to remind him that nothing had truly passed, only shifted, and beside him Lyra lowered her hand completely now, the metal resting against her palm without purpose, without signal, just something she carried because she had chosen to, and that choice hung in the air between everything that had come and everything that would follow, and Ethan glanced at her again, not measuring her anymore, not trying to understand what she had been, but seeing what she was in that moment. Someone who had stepped out of something larger than this land and decided not to return, and he spoke quietly, almost as if the words belonged more to the night than to her. If they are not coming closer, they are waiting for something. And Lyra nodded once, slow, her eyes still forward. They are waiting for me to decide if I still belong to what they remember. And that word belong carried a weight that did not sit easily. Because belonging can be a gift or a chain depending on who holds it, and Ethan let out a slow breath, watching the still figures beyond the reach of his porch. And do you? He asked, not pressing, not demanding, just placing the question where it could exist, and Lyra did not answer right away, not because she did not know, but because she was choosing how to say it, and when she did speak, it was softer than anything before, but clearer. I belong to what I choose to protect, she said, and the words settled into the ground beneath them like something final, something that did not need to be repeated, and Ethan nodded slightly, because that was something he understood, not from stories, not from words, but from the quiet way a man builds a life out of what he refuses to lose, and the wind moved again, carrying less tension now, more distance, as if the land itself had accepted the answer before anyone else did. And out there, one of the figures shifted again, not forward, not back, but turning slightly, and that single motion carried through the others, subtle but real, like a decision moving through them without sound, and Ethan felt it before he saw it. The way the air changed when something had been resolved even if it had not yet ended, and Lyra stepped back then, just one step, not retreating, not yielding, but returning to the edge of the porch, and that movement said more than any words could have, because it was not about distance, it was about place, and she was choosing where she stood now, not where she had been, and Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the figures as they began to shift their stance, not dispersing, not vanishing, but turning their attention away from the line they had held, and that was enough. Enough to tell him that whatever claim had brought them here had just been released, not broken, not forgotten, but let go. And he stepped back onto the porch then, the wood creaking softly under his boots, a sound that felt almost unfamiliar after the long stretch of silence. And when he closed the door behind him, he did not shut out the night. He simply marked the boundary again, the same boundary that had been tested and held, and inside the cabin the fire still burned low, steady, unchanged, casting its quiet light across the walls that had witnessed more than they were built for, and Lyra stood just inside, no longer in shadow, no longer positioned for defense, just present, and she looked down at the metal in her hand for a long second before placing it on the table, not carefully, not carelessly, just letting it rest there between them. And Ethan watched that simple act with more attention than he had given anything else that night, because it was not about the object, it was about what it meant to set it down, and he walked over slowly, stopping on the other side of the table, looking at it without touching it. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, no longer waiting, just quiet. And then Lyra said, "I carried that because I thought I had to." And Ethan glanced up at her, meeting her eyes fully for the first time since the night began, and she continued, "But it was never mine to keep." And the words did not sound like loss, they sounded like release, and Ethan let out a slow breath, nodding once, not in agreement, not in judgment, just acknowledgement. And he reached out then, not to take the metal, not to move it away, but to turn it slightly, just enough that it no longer faced outward, no longer caught the light the same way. And that small gesture carried its own kind of meaning, not erasing what it was, but placing it where it no longer defined the moment. And Lyra watched him do it without speaking, and for the first time since she had stepped onto his land, there was something in her expression that did not belong to survival, something quieter, something that looked almost like rest. And outside the wind moved on, carrying the last traces of presence with it, leaving the land as it had been before, wide and open and indifferent. But something had changed within it, something that would not be undone by distance or time. And inside the cabin, between a man who had chosen to stand and a woman who had chosen not to return, the silence settled into something new, not empty, not waiting, but lived in. And for the first time that night, nothing needed to be decided anymore. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly through the cracks of the cabin walls, turning the darkness from black into something softer, something that no longer pressed but simply lingered. And Ethan Cole woke before the light fully settled, not because of a sound, but because the absence of it felt unfamiliar. And for a moment he lay still on the narrow bed, listening to the silence that had returned, the kind of silence that comes after something has passed through and chosen not to stay. And it took him a second longer than it should have to remember why the night had felt different. And when he did, he sat up slowly, the wood of the floor cool beneath his boots as he stepped down, his eyes moving instinctively toward the table where the small piece of metal rested, exactly where it had been left, unchanged, quiet. And then to the far side of the room where Lyra stood by the window, not asleep, not resting, just watching the horizon as the first thin line of light stretched across it. And there was something in the way she stood that had changed, not the readiness, not the balance, but the tension that had once held it all together had eased, like a rope that had finally been allowed to loosen without snapping. And Ethan did not speak right away, because some mornings ask for observation before words, and he moved toward the door instead, opening it just enough to step outside, the air cold and clean, carrying nothing but the scent of dust and distance. And he looked out toward the ridge where the figures had stood, and there was nothing there now, no movement, no trace, just open land stretching as far as it always had. And he let out a slow breath, not relief, not quite, just acknowledgement that whatever had come had chosen to leave. And when he turned back, Lyra was standing closer now, just inside the doorway, her eyes following his gaze out into the empty space. And she did not ask what he saw. She already knew. And he spoke quietly. "They are gone." And she nodded once, not surprised, not relieved, just confirming something she had already accepted. And for a moment they stood there together, the morning light slowly filling the space between them. And Ethan realized that the cabin felt different now, not because anything inside had changed, but because something outside no longer pressed against it. And he stepped back in, closing the door gently behind him, and his eyes returned to the table, to the metal that still rested there. And he reached out this time, not hesitating, not questioning, just picking it up with a careful grip, turning it slightly in his hand, feeling its weight, its shape, the precision of its edges. And it did not feel like something meant to be held by a servant. It felt like something meant to be carried by someone who had once stood at the center of something larger than this place. And he looked up at her, holding it loosely, not offering it back, not keeping it either, just holding it between them. "If it was never yours to keep," he said, "why did you carry it this far?" And Lyra stepped closer, her gaze settling on the object for a moment before lifting back to his face. And when she answered, her voice was steady, but softer than it had been the night before. Because I did not know how to let it go without losing who I was. And the honesty in that answer did not ask for understanding. It simply existed, and Ethan nodded slowly, because he understood that more than he would ever say. The way a man can carry something long after it has stopped serving him, not because he needs it, but because he does not know what he will be without it. And he placed the metal back on the table, not in the same position as before, but closer to her side. And that small shift carried meaning, not returning it, not discarding it, just placing it where it belonged now, within her reach but no longer between them. And Lyra watched that movement carefully, and for the first time since she had stepped onto his land, there was something in her expression that resembled ease, not complete, not unguarded, but real enough to notice. And she moved to the table, resting her fingers lightly near the metal without picking it up, as if acknowledging its presence without claiming it again. And the morning light caught it differently now, softer, less defined, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the window where the horizon had fully emerged, wide and open, untouched by the events of the night. And he spoke again, quieter this time. You said you belong to what you choose to protect. And she nodded, her eyes following his toward the land beyond. Yes, she said. And he let the silence stretch for a moment before asking the question that had been waiting since the night began. And what do you choose now? And Lyra did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she was choosing how to say it. And when she did speak, it was simple, clear, and final, something that does not need to be claimed. And the words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not uncertain, just true. And Ethan felt something in his chest ease again, not because the future had become clear, but because it no longer needed to be decided all at once. And he nodded once, turning slightly toward the stove, the small routines of the day beginning to return without effort. And as he reached for the kettle, he paused for just a second, glancing back at her, at the way she stood in the light now instead of the shadow. And for the first time since she arrived, he did not see a stranger at his door. He saw someone who had chosen to stay, not because she needed shelter, but because she had decided where she belonged. And outside, the wind moved across the open land again, carrying nothing with it this time. No shapes, no presence, just distance. And inside the cabin, the quiet remained, not waiting, not tense, just steady, like something that had found its place and did not need to prove it anymore. The morning did not rush them. It settled in slow and patient, like the land itself was allowing them time to understand what had changed. And Ethan Cole stood by the stove with the kettle beginning to warm, the soft crackle of heat returning to the cabin like a familiar voice that had waited its turn. And behind him Lyra remained near the table, her hand no longer hovering near the metal but resting lightly on the wood, grounded, present, as if she no longer needed to measure the room for exits or angles. And that alone told Ethan more than anything she had said, because a person who stops mapping escape has decided something deeper than words can hold. And he poured a small amount of water into a tin cup, the sound simple, steady, and he placed it on the table within her reach without comment, not offering, not insisting, just placing it there. And she looked at it for a moment before taking it. Not with hesitation, not with gratitude, just acceptance. And that quiet exchange carried a kind of balance neither of them tried to define. And outside the horizon stretched wide under the growing light. The same land, the same distance, but without the presence that had filled it the night before. And Ethan stepped toward the door again, opening it halfway this time, letting the morning air move freely through the cabin, carrying with it the smell of dry earth and something faintly new, something that did not belong to fear or tension, just open space. And he leaned slightly against the frame, looking out without searching, and Lyra's voice came from behind him, softer than before, but no less steady. They will not return for what I was. And Ethan nodded once, not turning, because he already understood that, not from what he had seen, but from what he had felt in that final stillness. No, he said, but the land remembers everything that passes through it. And she stepped closer then, stopping a few feet behind him, her gaze following his out across the empty distance. And there was no tension in her posture now, only awareness, the kind that remains even when the threat has passed. And she spoke again. Memory does not decide where you stand. And Ethan let that settle, because it was a truth he had spent years learning in his own way, building a life out of what he chose to carry and what he chose to leave behind. And he stepped back inside, closing the door gently, not to shut out the world, but to mark the space again, the same space that had held through the night and now felt different without changing at all. And his eyes returned briefly to the metal on the table, still where he had placed it, quiet, no longer catching the light the way it had before, and he moved toward it, not picking it up this time, just resting his hand on the table beside it. And he spoke without looking directly at her. "You can leave it here." And the words were simple, but they carried more than an offer. They carried permission without expectation, and Lyra looked at the object for a long second, her fingers brushing the edge of the table, and when she answered, her voice held something new, something lighter beneath the steadiness. "Or I can leave it behind without leaving." And Ethan glanced at her then, meeting her eyes fully, and there was no confusion in his expression, only understanding, and he nodded once, because the difference between leaving something and abandoning it is choice, and choice was the one thing she had claimed for herself. And the cabin settled around them again, the small sounds of the morning returning without effort, the faint creak of wood, the quiet shift of heat, the kind of details a man stops noticing until they disappear. And Ethan moved back toward the stove, pouring more water, setting another cup without thinking, and that small act, unspoken, unannounced, carried its own meaning, because it was not about hospitality, it was about inclusion, and Lyra watched it without comment. But the way she stepped closer to the table, no longer at its edge but within its space, said enough, and outside the wind moved again, lighter now, carrying no weight with it, just distance and time. And Ethan leaned slightly against the counter, his gaze drifting toward the window, and he spoke again, quieter this time. "This place does not offer much," and Lyra answered just as quietly. "It offers something that cannot be taken." And that answer lingered, because it was not about land or shelter or safety. It was about the kind of quiet a person chooses to stand in. And Ethan let out a slow breath, something in his chest settling in a way he had not expected, not because anything had been resolved, but because nothing needed to be forced anymore. And he glanced once more at the metal on the table, then back at her, and he said, "Then you can stay." And there was no condition in his voice, no limitation, just a statement placed where it could exist without pressure. And Lyra did not respond immediately. She did not thank him, did not question it. She simply nodded once, a small, deliberate motion. And in that moment it was clear that she was not accepting shelter, she was accepting a place. And the difference mattered more than anything either of them could have explained. And the morning light filled the cabin completely now, touching every surface, every corner, and the space that had once held tension and distance now held something quieter, something steady, and outside the land remained unchanged, wide and indifferent. But inside, between a man who had chosen to stand and a woman who had chosen not to return, something had settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to be proven. The day moved forward the way it always did, without asking who had changed overnight and who had not. The sun climbing slow over the open land as if nothing had happened, as if no line had been drawn and held in the quiet dark. And Ethan Cole found himself standing in the doorway again, not out of habit, but because something in him needed to see the horizon in daylight, needed to measure what remained after the night had passed. And the land looked the same, dry and wide, stretching out past the fence line into distance that had never belonged to him. And yet it felt different, not in shape, not in color, but in weight, as if something unseen had been lifted and carried away. And behind him the soft sound of movement inside the cabin did not carry the same alertness it had before, no longer careful, no longer measured for threat, just present, and that alone told him more than anything else could have. And he stepped out onto the porch, letting the sun touch his face, the warmth, light but real. And for a moment he closed his eyes, not in rest, but in acknowledgement of something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. And when he opened them again, he noticed a detail he might have missed before, the faint trace of footsteps in the dust beyond the yard, not scattered, not rushed, but deliberate, moving away from the ridge, away from his land. and he studied them for a second longer than necessary, not out of concern, but because they marked something final. Not a retreat, not a loss, but a decision carried out without noise. And he let out a slow breath before turning back inside. The cabin cooler than the air outside now, holding the quiet in a way that felt almost protective. And Lyra stood near the table, no longer at its edge, no longer watching the door or the window, but simply there, her posture steady without tension, and the metal piece remained where it had been placed, untouched, unclaimed, and that detail mattered more than anything else, because it meant she had not reached for it again, had not felt the need to carry it back into herself. And Ethan moved toward the shelf, taking down a worn piece of cloth and setting it beside the table without comment, a small gesture, simple, but intentional, and she looked at it for a moment before understanding the purpose, not as an order, not as an expectation, but as an invitation to place something away if she chose to. And she did not move immediately, did not reach for the metal. She simply stood there, considering it, and Ethan did not watch her closely, did not wait for her decision. He turned instead to the small tasks of the day, the kind that keep a man grounded in a place that does not ask questions. And he stepped outside again, checking the fence line out of habit more than necessity, the wood post steady, the wire holding as it always had. And as he walked the short distance along the boundary, he found himself thinking not about what had come, but about what had stayed. And that thought settled deeper than he expected, because staying is not always the easier choice. And when he returned to the cabin, the door opened to let the air pass through. He saw the difference immediately. The cloth on the table now folded once, and the metal resting on top of it, not hidden, not displayed, just placed. And Lyra stood a few feet away, her hands empty, her posture unchanged but lighter in a way that could not be explained. And Ethan paused in the doorway, taking in that small change, because it carried more meaning than anything that had been said. And he stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind him without sound. And he moved toward the table, not touching the cloth or the metal, just acknowledging their presence with a glance. And he spoke quietly. "That is a different kind of keeping." And Lyra looked at him, her expression steady but no longer guarded. And she nodded once. "It does not belong in my hand anymore," she said. And there was no regret in her voice, no hesitation, just a simple truth that had been accepted. And Ethan let out a slow breath, nodding slightly, because he understood that kind of release, the kind that does not erase the past but no longer carries it forward. And he stepped back, giving the table its space, as if it held something that did not need to be disturbed, and the cabin settled again around them. The quiet now filled with something steadier than before, something that did not shift with every sound or movement. And outside the wind moved across the land again, carrying nothing but distance and time. And inside, the light moved slowly across the floor, touching the table, the cloth, the metal, and then passing on, as if even it did not need to linger. And Ethan leaned slightly against the wall, his gaze drifting toward her once more, and he spoke without pressure, without expectation. "There is work to be done here." And she met his eyes, not with uncertainty, not with obligation, but with something that resembled choice. And she nodded once, small but clear. And in that moment it was understood without being said, that she was not staying because she had nowhere else to go. She was staying because she had decided where she would stand. And that difference settled into the space between them like something solid, something that would not shift with the next wind or the next night. And Ethan turned back toward the door again, not because he needed to check the horizon, but because it was still there, wide and open. And now, for the first time in a long time, it did not feel like something he had to guard against. It felt like something he could simply live beside. The sun climbed higher without ceremony, stretching its light across the land as if it had always belonged there. And Ethan Cole found himself moving through the day with a steadiness that did not need to be forced, the kind that comes when something inside has settled without asking permission. And the work that once felt like routine now carried a different weight, not heavier, not lighter, just chosen. And he walked along the fence line again, not to check for damage this time, but because the act itself grounded him, the rhythm of his steps matching the quiet pace of the land. And behind him, closer to the cabin, Lyra moved with the same quiet control she had shown since the moment she arrived, but there was something new in it. Now, Not the edge of readiness, not the constant awareness of exit and threat, but a kind of presence that stayed where it was, and Ethan noticed it in the smallest ways. The way she paused to look across the horizon without scanning it. The way her hands no longer hovered near anything that could be used for defense. The way she allowed stillness to exist without breaking it. And that was the kind of change a man does not question, because it cannot be explained, it can only be seen, and the wind moved through the dry grass again, carrying nothing but the sound of distance, and Ethan stopped for a moment, resting his hand against one of the fence posts, the wood warm under his palm, and he looked out across the land that had never belonged to him and never would. And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was guarding it. He felt like he was part of it, and that difference settled deeper than anything else. And when he turned back toward the cabin, he saw her, standing near the water barrel, her reflection faint in the surface as she looked down, not searching, not questioning, just observing, and the metal on the table inside remained untouched, still resting on the folded cloth, and that detail carried forward into the day without needing to be revisited, because what had been decided did not need to be repeated, and Ethan stepped back onto the porch, the wood creaking softly beneath his boots, a familiar sound that no longer felt like it was holding something together, and he leaned slightly against the doorframe, watching her for a moment without calling out, and she sensed it, not by sound, but by presence, turning her head just enough to meet his gaze, and there was no distance in that look now, no barrier of role or expectation, just recognition, and he spoke quietly, not as a question, but as a continuation of something that had already begun. The land does not ask who you were, and she held his gaze for a second longer, before answering, her voice steady, grounded, only where you stand, and the words settled between them like something that had always been there, waiting to be said, and Ethan nodded once, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to add, and he stepped back inside, moving past the table without looking directly at it, because it no longer held his attention the way it had before, and Lyra followed a moment later, not trailing, not hesitating, just entering the space as if it had already made room for her, and the cabin held them both without strain, the air moving freely through the open door, carrying the scent of dust and sun, and Ethan reached for a worn tool near the wall, setting it down on the table beside the folded cloth, not covering the metal, not moving it aside, just placing something else next to it. And that simple act carried its own meaning, because it did not erase what had been, it added to what was, and Lyra watched that movement without comment. And for the first time since she arrived, she stepped closer to the table without stopping at its edge, her hand resting lightly on the wood near both objects, not claiming either one, just acknowledging them, and Ethan leaned slightly against the counter again, his gaze drifting toward the open door where the light continued to spill in, and he spoke once more, quieter now. There will be days when this place feels too small, and she nodded once, not denying it, not resisting it, and days when it feels enough, she replied, and that balance, that acceptance of both, settled into the space like something steady, something that would not break under change, and the wind moved again, softer now, carrying nothing with it but time, and outside the land stretched on as it always had, indifferent to who walked it or why, and inside the cabin, the quiet did not press or wait, it simply existed, filled with the kind of presence that does not demand explanation, and Ethan looked at her once more, not measuring, not questioning, just seeing, and he realized then that whatever had come in the night had not taken anything from this place. It had revealed something that had been waiting beneath it all along, something that did not belong to the past or the distance or the figures that had stood on the ridge, but to the simple act of choosing where to stand and remaining there without needing to prove it. And Lyra turned slightly toward the open door, her gaze following the light, out into the land, and for the first time since she arrived, there was no part of her that looked ready to leave, not because she could not, but because she had decided she did not need to, and that decision settled into the cabin, into the land, into the quiet itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that did not need to be spoken again. The afternoon settled into evening the way it always did, without announcement, without ceremony, the light stretching longer across the ground before slowly pulling back, leaving the land in that quiet in-between where nothing is claimed and nothing is lost. And Ethan Cole stood once more at the edge of his porch, not out of habit now, but because it had become the place where things revealed themselves without needing to be spoken. And the horizon lay open before him, unchanged, unmarked, carrying no trace of what had passed through it the night before. And yet he knew, in the same quiet way a man knows the weight of his own hands, that something had shifted, not out there, but here, in the space he occupied, in the choices that had been made without being named. And behind him the cabin held its steady warmth, the faint glow of the fire beginning to rise again as the air cooled. And Lyra moved within that space with a calm that no longer carried tension, her steps no longer measured against danger, but aligned with something simpler, something that did not need to be guarded. And Ethan listened to that movement for a moment, not because he needed to track it, but because it had become part of the place itself, like the creak of wood or the sound of wind passing through the dry grass. And he spoke without turning, his voice low, steady. Out here, things either stay or they pass through. And he let the words sit there, not directed, not demanding, just present. And behind him there was a pause, not hesitation, but consideration. And then Lyra stepped closer, stopping just inside the doorway, her gaze following his out into the fading light. And she answered, just as steady. And some things choose to become part of the ground they stand on. And that answer did not feel like a response. It felt like a continuation of something that had already been decided. And Ethan nodded once, not because he needed to agree, but because there was nothing in it to question. And the wind moved again, slower now, carrying the last warmth of the day across the open land. And for a moment the silence between them deepened, not heavy, not waiting, just full. And Ethan turned then, stepping back into the cabin, letting the door rest open behind him. And his eyes moved briefly to the table, to the folded cloth, to the metal that still rested there, untouched since it had been set down. And he did not stop, did not reach for it, because it no longer called for attention. It had become something else now, something that belonged to the story but no longer directed it. And he moved past it, taking a seat near the fire, the chair creaking softly under his weight. And Lyra remained standing for a moment longer before stepping fully inside, closing the distance between herself and the center of the room without hesitation, without pause. And she did not take the position she had first chosen, near the wall, near the exit. She moved instead to the other side of the table, the space that faced him, the space that had once been empty. And she rested her hand lightly against the back of the chair there, not sitting, not claiming it, just acknowledging it. And Ethan watched that movement in silence, because it carried more meaning than anything that had been said. And after a moment, he reached down, pulling the chair slightly away from the table, not as an invitation spoken aloud, but as a space made available. And then he leaned back again, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. And Lyra looked at the chair, then at him. And for a brief second something passed through her expression, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but recognition of what was being offered. And she stepped forward, lowering herself into the seat without ceremony, without hesitation. And that simple act settled into the room like something final, something that did not need to be explained, because it was not about where she sat. It was about where she no longer stood. And the fire cracked softly, the sound filling the space between them without breaking it. And outside the last light of the day slipped below the horizon, leaving the land in darkness once more. But it was not the same darkness as before. It did not press. It did not carry weight. It simply existed. And inside the cabin the quiet held steady, not tense, not uncertain, just present. And Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes resting on her for a moment longer before drifting toward the fire. And he spoke one last time, not as a conclusion, not as a statement, but as something that belonged to the place itself. Out here, you do not need to be claimed to belong. And Lyra did not answer right away. She did not need to. She simply sat there, her posture steady, her presence aligned with the space she had chosen. And after a moment, she reached out, not for the metal, not for the cloth, but for the empty space on the table between them, resting her hand there lightly. And in that quiet gesture, everything that had come before settled into something simple, something human, something that did not need to be carried any further. And the night moved on. Outside, wide and silent. And inside, the story did not end. It simply found its place and stayed.